Okay, so we are back. So there's a question that I've had. Why do Christians say America needs to come back to God when Americans were never with God in the first place? You have to be with, you know, you have to be with God in order to come back to Him. Okay, and these are some scriptures that I found pretty much supports it. Um, John chapter 18, verse 36. Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants fight, that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now is my kingdom not from hence." Okay. Uh, Many Christians try to use, say, Christian nationalism and try to say, well, America needs to come back to God. It never was with God in the first place. Okay. If you look through American history, you will see that. Okay. You also see with Manifest Destiny. Okay. Manifest Destiny was that God gave the settlers the right, European settlers, the right to take land and expand as they see fit, slaughtering the inhabitants, Native Americans. All right. That is what is told in school. Okay. All right. It's just basically propaganda. All right. And people will be upset. Some patriotic Christians will be upset about me saying this because they believe that they could use the Old Testament to justify the actions of wars. But let's get into another scripture. Okay, that's basically proves what I'm talking about here. All right, another one. Like I said, people prefer. I remember doing a live stream on the topic. People prefer a dead Jesus, okay, and they prefer a Jesus that they can make up in their own mind instead of the Jesus that says, "Turn the other cheek, love your enemies." All right. Hebrews chapter 11, verses 13 to 16. These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on this earth. For they that say such things declare plainly that they seek a country. And truly, if they had been mindful of that country from whence they came out, they might have had an opportunity to have returned. But now they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly. Wherefore God is not ashamed to be called their God. He hath prepared for them a city. All right. So basically, you're seeing here, all right, um, Christians given the instruction to understand that they are just pilgrims passing through, that this world is not your home. All right. That is what they've been instructed on how to think. And this rubs Christians the wrong way because it strips them of the trappings of nationalism or nationalistic pride. All right. Not to fall into the sea of propaganda that has been used by the powerful to gain resources. Meanwhile, filling people, the common class like you and me, with lies. All right. We're going to check out this one right here. talking about King Ahab and the vineyard owner Nabal. All right. Turn with me to 1 Kings chapter 21. And it came to pass after these things that Naboth the Jezreelite had a vineyard, which was in Jezreel, hard by the palace of Ahab, king of Samaria. And Ahab spoke unto Naboth, saying, Give me thy vineyard, that I may have it for a garden of herbs, because it is near unto my house, and I will give thee for it a better vineyard than it. Or if it seem good to thee, I will give thee worth of it in money. And Naboth said to Ahab, The Lord forbid it me, that I should give the inheritance of my fathers unto thee. And Ahab came to his house heavy and displeased because of the word which Naboth the Jezreelite had spoken to him. For he hath said, I will not give thee the inheritance of my fathers. And he laid down upon his bed and turned away his face and would not and eat no bread. So you can see the entitlement here. But Jezebel his wife came to him and said unto him, Why is thy spirit so sad that thou eatest no bread? And he said unto her, Because I spake unto Naboth the Jezreelite, and said unto him, Give me thy vineyard for money or less, or else, if it please thee, I will give thee another vineyard for it. And he answered, I will not give thee my vineyard. This is how the rich who are evil think. If a person that they feel is lower to them does not give them what they want, they have they act like children and pout. And Jezebel his wife said unto him, Dost thou now govern the kingdom of Israel? Arise and eat bread, and let thy heart be merry. I will give thee the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite. So she wrote letters in Ahab's name, and sealed them with his seal, and sent letters unto the elders and to the nobles that were in the city dwelling with Naboth. And she wrote in the letters, Proclaim a fast, and set Naboth on high among the people, and set two men, sons of Belial, before him, to bear witness against him, saying, Thou didst blaspheme God and the king, and carry him out and stone him, that he might die. And the men of the city, even the elders and the nobles who were the inhabitants in his city, did as Jezebel had sent unto them, and it was written in the letters which she had sent unto them. They proclaimed a fast, and set Naboth high among the people. And there came in two men, children of Belial, and sat before him. And the men of Belial witnessed against him, even against Naboth, in the presence of the people, saying, Naboth did blaspheme God and the king. Then they carried him forth out of the city, and stoned him with stones, that he died. Then they sent to Jezebel, saying, Naboth is stoned and is dead. And it came to pass when Jezebel heard that Naboth was stoned and was dead, that Jezebel said unto Ahab, Arise, take possession of the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite, which he refused to give thee for money. For Naboth is not alive, but dead. And it came to pass when Ahab heard that Naboth was dead, that Ahab arose to go down to the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite and take possession of it. All right. So you see, all right, this is how you're wondering, why am I reading this? This is how propaganda works. Okay. The American government, all right, or any I wouldn't be surprised if other militaries do the same thing around the world, that they make up lies, okay, villainize somebody to get resources. All right. And that is what happened. Okay. And this is also the we all know what happened with this story. Also, if you have ever read about King Ahab and the vineyard owner Naboth. All right. And the word of the Lord came to Elijah the Tishbite, saying, Arise, go down to meet Ahab, king of Israel, which is in Samaria. Behold, he is in the vineyard of Naboth, whither he is gone down to possess it. And thou shalt speak unto him, saying, Thus saith the Lord, Hast thou killed and taken possession? And thou shalt speak unto him, saying, Thus saith the Lord, In the place where dogs lick the blood of Naboth, shall dogs lick thy blood, even thine. And Ahab said to Elijah, Thou hast found me, O my enemy. He answered, I have found thee, because thou hast sold thyself to work evil in the sight of the Lord. And that is what the American government and crooked politicians and bureaucrats have done. They sold themselves to do evil. Okay. 1 minute. Talk about the Vietnam War. Example.
Vietnam War was based on a lie. In August 1964, an American destroyer named the USS Maddox was hanging out on the coast of North Vietnam. It was in enemy waters, as the United States had already been trying to topple the North Vietnamese government for years by that point. Well, on August 2nd, the USS Maddox was attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. 2 days later, North Vietnamese torpedo boats attacked it again. In response, the U.S. Congress effectively gave President Lyndon Johnson the authority to go to war against North Vietnam. But here's the thing. The USS Maddox wasn't attacked. Well, North Vietnamese torpedo boats did fire on the USS Maddox on August 2nd, but only after it first fired shots at them. In the supposed second attack 2 days later, it never happened at all. It's possible that millions of people died because of that lie.
Do you see what I'm talking about here? Okay. I'll read an article right here. All right. Okay, talking about the Vietnam War. All right. The secrets and lies of the Vietnam War exposed in one epic document. All right. Brandishing a captured Chinese machine gun, Secretary of Defense Robert S. McNamara appeared at a televised news conference in the spring of 1965. The United States had just sent its first combat troops to South Vietnam, and the new push, he boasted, was further wearing down the beleaguered Viet Cong. In the past 4.5 years, the Viet Cong, the communists, had lost 89,000 men, he said. You can see the heavy drain. That was a lie. From confidential reports, McNamara knew the situation was bad and deteriorating in the South. The Viet Cong haven't the initiative, the information, he said. Defeatism is gaining among the rural populations, somewhat in the cities, and even among the soldiers. Lies like McNamara's were the rule, not the exception. Throughout America's involvement in Vietnam, the lies were repeated to the public, to Congress, in closed-door hearings, in speeches, and to the press. The real story might have remained unknown if, in 1967, McNamara had not commissioned a secret history based on the classified documents, which came to be known as the Pentagon Papers. By then, he knew that even with nearly 500,000 U.S. troops in theater, the war was at a stalemate. He created a research team to assemble and analyze Defense Department decision making dating back to 1945. This was either quixotic or arrogant. As Secretary of Defense under President John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson, McNamara was an architect of the war and implicated in the lies that were the bedrock of U.S. policy. Daniel Ellsberg, an analyst on the study, eventually leaked portions of the report to the New York Times, which published excerpts in 1971. The revelations in the Pentagon Papers infuriated a country sick of the war, the body bags of young Americans, the photographs of Vietnamese civilians fleeing U.S. air attacks, and the endless protests and counter protests that were dividing the country, as nothing had since the Civil War. The lies revealed in the papers were of a generational scale and from much of the American public. This grand deception seeded a suspicion of government that is even more widespread today. Officially titled The Report of the Office of Secretary of Defense Vietnam Task Force, the papers filled 47 volumes covering the administrations of President Franklin D. Roosevelt to President Lyndon B. Johnson. Their 7,000 pages chronicled in cold, bureaucratic language how the United States got itself married in a long, costly war in a small Southeast Asian country of questionable strategic importance. They are an essential record of the first war the United States lost. For modern historians, they foreshadowed the mindset and miscalculations that led the United States to fight the forever war of Iraq and Afghanistan. The original sin was the decision to support the French rulers in Vietnam. President Harry S. Truman subsidized their effort to take back their Indochina colonies. The Vietnamese nationalists were winning their fight for independence under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh, a communist. Ho had worked with the United States against Japan in World War II, but in the Cold War, Washington would recast him as a stalking horse of Soviet expansionism. American intelligence officers in the field said that was not the case, that they had found no evidence of a Soviet plot to take over Vietnam, much less Southeast Asia. As one State Department memo put it, if there is a Moscow-directed conspiracy in Southeast Asia, Indochina is an anomaly. But with an eye on China, where the communist Mao Zedong had won the Civil War, President Dwight Eisenhower said defeating Vietnam's communists was essential to block further communist expansion in Asia. If Vietnam became communist, then the countries of Southeast Asia will fall like dominoes. This belief in this domino theory was so strong that the United States broke with its European allies and refused to sign the 1954 Geneva Accords ending the French War. Instead, the United States continued the fight, giving full backing to Nguyen Thi Dinh, the autocratic anti-communist leader of the South Vietnam. General J. Lawton Collins wrote from Vietnam, warning Eisenhower that Dinh was an unpopular and incapable leader that should be replaced. If he was not, General Collins wrote, I recommend reevaluation of our plans for assisting Southeast Asia. All right. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles disagreed, writing in a cable included in the Pentagon Papers, we have no other choice but to continue our aid to Vietnam and to support of Dinh. 9 years and billions of American dollars later, Dinh was still in power, and it fell to President Kennedy to solve the long-predicted problem. After facing down the Soviet Union in Berlin crisis, Kennedy wanted to avoid any sign of Cold War fatigue and easily accepted McNamara's counsel to deepen the U.S. commitment to Saigon. All right. Sorry, hold on 1 minute. All right. Let's come into Saigon. The Secretary of Defense wrote in one report, the loss of South Vietnam would make pointless any further discussion about the importance of Southeast Asia to the free world. The president increased U.S. military advisors tenfold and introduced helicopter missions. In return for the support, Kennedy wanted Dinh to make democratic reforms, Diem refused. A popular uprising in South Vietnam, led by Buddhist clerics, followed. Fearful of losing power as well, South Vietnamese generals secretly received American approval to overthrow Diem. Despite official denials, U.S. officials were deeply involved. Beginning in August of 1963, with various authorized, sanctioned, and encouraged coups of efforts, the Pentagon Papers revealed we maintained clandestine contact with them throughout the planning and execution of the coup and sought to review their operational plans. The coup ended with Dim's killing and a deepening of American involvement in the war. As the authors of the papers concluded, our complicity in his overthrow heightened our responsibilities and commitment. 3 weeks later, President Kennedy was assassinated and the Vietnam issue fell to President Johnson. He had officials secretly draft a resolution for Congress to grant him the authority to fight in Vietnam without officially declaring war. Missing was a pretext of a small bore Pearl Harbor moment that came on August 4th, 1964, when the White House announced that the North Vietnamese had attacked the USS Maddox in international waters in the Gulf of Tonkin. This attack, though, was anything but unprovoked aggression. General William C. Westmoreland, the head of U.S. forces in Vietnam, had commanded the South Vietnamese military while they staged clandestine raids on North Vietnamese islands. North Vietnamese PT boats fought back and had mistaken Maddox for a South Vietnamese escort vessel, according to a report. Later, investigations showed the attack never happened. Testifying before the Senate, McNamara lied, denying any involvement in the Tonkin Gulf attacks. Our Navy played absolute no part in it, not associated with, was not aware of any of his South Vietnamese actions, if there were any. He lied. Okay. So you're seeing a whole bunch of murder and you're seeing a whole bunch of lying. Okay? As we're seeing here. And we're seeing also that Christians should not be joining the military because you're going to be risking, yes, risking being 100% of the time being a pawn for these evil military generals and corrupt elite. 3 days after the announcement of the incident, the administration persuaded Congress to pass the Tonkin Gulf Resolution to approve and support the determination of the president as commander-in-chief to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States, to prevent further aggression and expansion of the presidential power to wage war that is still used regularly. Johnson won the 1964 election in a landslide. Several months later, he sent combat troops to Vietnam without declaring war, a decision clad in lies. The initial deployment of 20,000 troops were described as military support forces under a change of mission to permit their more active use in Vietnam. Nothing new. As the Pentagon Papers showed later, the Defense Department also revised its war aims: 70% to avoid a humiliating U.S. defeat, 20% to keep South Vietnam and then adjacent territory from Chinese hands, 10% to permit the people of South Vietnam to enjoy a better free way of life. Westmoreland considered the initial troop deployment a stopgap measuring and requested 100,000 more. McNamara agreed. On July 20th, 1965, he wrote in a memo, even though the U.S. killed in action might be in the vicinity of 500 a month, by the end of the year, the general's overall strategy was likely to bring about a success in Vietnam. As the Pentagon Papers later put it, never again while he was Secretary of Defense would McNamara make so optimistic a statement about Vietnam, except in public. Fully disillusioned, at last, McNamara argued in 1967 memo to President that more of the same, more troops, more bombing would not win the war. In an about face, he suggested that the United States declare victory and slowly withdraw. All right, so all this was for nothing. They didn't even really win, okay? Just declare victory and slowly withdraw. Not actually winning, just declare victory. Lives were lost, okay, over a lie. All right, and just declare victory. And in a rare acknowledgement of the suffering of the Vietnamese people, he wrote, the picture of the world's greatest superpower killing or seriously injuring 1,000 non-combatants a week, seriously injuring 1,000 non-combatants a week, while trying to pound a tiny backward nation into submission on an issue whose merits are hotly disputed is not a pretty one. Johnson was furious and soon approved increasing the U.S. troop commitment to nearly 550,000. By year's end, he had forced McNamara to resign, but the defense secretary had already commissioned the Pentagon Papers. All right. That's all I'm going to read right now. Okay. But let's look into something else. Okay. You ever wonder about Hollywood and the connection with the military? Let's find that out right now.
All have in common? Well, they're all made possible. This, and this all have in common? Well, they're all made possible by the support of the US military. The US Department of Defense has a long and cozy relationship with big budget Hollywood blockbusters. It strikes sweetheart deals that give
One second. Give me 1 minute. Give me 1 minute. Okay, we are back. We are back.
this, and this all have in common? Well, they're all made possible by the support of the US military. The US Department of Defense has a long and cozy relationship with big budget Hollywood blockbusters. It strikes sweetheart deals that give film production companies access to military bases, equipment, and even personnel in exchange for a little creative input. In other words, film production companies get to make big action sequences on the cheap in exchange for giving the Pentagon veto power over anything critical of the military. A Pentagon liaison has claimed that they'll approve any script that portrays.
So basically, you can't really, if you want to tell the truth about the U.S. military, you couldn't. If you wanted to tell the masses, you couldn't in Hollywood. It had to go through the military first. And if they don't like it, if it makes them look in a bad light, then they have a right to tell you, no, you're not going to talk about this. Suppressing the truth in unrighteousness. Romans, the book of, the book of Romans.
Portrays the military realistically. But they also say that anything critical of the military isn't portraying it realistically.
Your major malfunction, numbnuts!
Several Iron Men, multiple Captains America, and Captain Marvel have all been made this way, to name just a few recent examples. Brie Larson even did tie-in recruitment ads for the military.
The core.
So you get the picture, basically. All right. Under the military, Hollywood is a propaganda tool for the military to spread lies. All right. Just like I talked about the Gulf of Tonkin incident, spreading lies and causing death and enlisting more people to die. All right. So I always ask, coming back to God when America was never with God in the first place. All right. So let's talk about the atomic bombs of Japan. Let's talk about that. Here we go.
Bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were justified.
There's this common misconception that using the atomic weapons dropped in Japan was not only necessary to end the war, but it was also the most humanitarian option because it would prevent massive amount of deaths on both sides. But in reality, the United States became the first and only nation to use atomic weapons that unalived over 200,000 civilians, not because it was necessary, but because they were trying to send a message to the Soviet Union. According to the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, they actually believed that it was not necessary to drop the two bombs to end the war. They stated that, based on a detailed investigation of all the facts and supported by the testimony of the surviving Japanese leaders involved, it is the survey's opinion that certainly prior to 31st of December, and in all possibility prior to the 1st of November in 1945, Japan would have surrendered even if the atomic bombs had not been dropped, even if Russia had not entered the war, and even if no invasion had been planned or contemplated. The real reason they used atomic bombs is published in the US Department of Energy called the Manhattan Project. It states if use of the atomic bomb made victory possible without an invasion, then accepting Soviet help would only invite them into the discussions regarding the post-war fate of Japan. So in essence, the two atomic weapons not only ended World War II, it also kickstarted the Cold War. As a result, what the United States were afraid of happening in Japan was eventually realized in Korea. TLDR version, the United States used atomic weapons not because it was necessary, but in order to expand the US empire.
That's basically what it was. Okay? People suffered with radiation poisoning. Their kids were born deformed, blinded. Okay? I went to a Japanese museum where they had murals, not murals, photographs of the effects of the atomic bomb dropped in Hiroshima. Okay? Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Um, and those photographs were horrific. Children were born deformed. Okay, people were disfigured. It was very grotesque and it was horrifying. All right. That, and people, Christians, want to say that it's okay, to join the military. All right. When the military government tells you where to go, who to kill, who to destroy. All right. Did Jesus say that's okay? Don't bring up the Old Testament because we're not living in those times anymore. Also in the Old Testament, God was pronouncing judgment on tribes who he tried to reach with, because according to the book of Romans, we all have a conscience. And that's our guide. A conscience given by God tells us right from wrong. Okay. And people kept rejecting him and people kept doing what they wanted to do, keep having premarital sex, homosexuality, molesting kids, orgies, sacrificing their babies to demon false gods. All right. And God had enough and sent the people of Israel to destroy them for their evil. That is why God had a military back then under the Old Testament. All right. The atomic bombing of Japan were based on lies. Okay. On the 78th anniversary of the atomic bombing of Japan, we should remember that deploying the bomb wasn't necessary to win the war. U.S. policymakers were aware of this fact, yet they pressed on, thereby authorizing the atrocity that launched the nuclear age. As we mark the 78th anniversary of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we bear witness to the peculiar paradox. On one hand, a greater percentage of Americans than ever before now doubt the necessity of using nuclear weapons against Japan. By contrast, the arguments justifying their use remain stubbornly persistent. This is noteworthy considering the historical evidence now clearly indicates that Japan was on the brink of surrender at the moment when these weapons were employed. The decision to initiate an instant Holocaust against potentially as many as 210,000 Japanese civilians was complex and multifaceted. The principal argument mounted to justify the use of atomic bombs, that they would quickly end the war and avoid an invasion that could result in many as 1 million casualties, doesn't hold much weight. You see, the thing is like when military generals want to talk this nonsense and American politicians want to talk this nonsense. They wouldn't like it if another foreign nation did that to them and said, well, if we drop an atomic bomb on America, we'd be saving hundreds and thousands of lives of our own troops that we had to put on the ground, as an alternative. They wouldn't like that, but it's okay to do it to others. All right. Instead, historically, evidence more strongly indicates America's desire to circumvent the need for negotiations with the Soviet Union over the future of East Asia. The Potsdam Conference, held by Allied leadership in the summer of 1945, aimed to determine the post-war settlement in Europe. The United States did not want to be forced into similar negotiations with the Soviets at the table for the post-war settlement of the Pacific. Since the mid-1990s, the ongoing dispute over the deployment of the bombs have been a front in the larger culture war. The conflict emerged when the Smithsonian Institution, in a bid to appease prevailing sentiments, forfeited the scholarly autonomy and halted a critical examination of the decision to use the bombs. The study was meant to complement the unveiling of the fully restored bomber Enola Gay. The persistence of discredited arguments justifying the bombings and their integration into the culture of American exceptionalism is by now laughable. Their existence underscores the need to reevaluate the key arguments that demonstrate the fundamentally needless nature of employing atomic weapons against Japan. According to the line of reasoning used to warrant the bombing, the use of nuclear weapons was intended to force Japan's immediate and unconditional surrender. This ended the war before millions of battle-hardened Soviet troops could pour into Eastern Asia. A happy corollary of this strategy was the prevention of potentially Soviet liberation of the continent of the Japanese rule, and the hindrance of Western European colonial powers' attempts to exploit labor and resources for post-war economic reconstruction. However, if this was indeed the intended objective, its ultimate result, despite the significant loss of Japanese civilian lives, was merely a temporary delay of the inevitable by a few years. It is worth considering the following key points. The United States stands alone as the only nation to employ nuclear weapons with hostile intent, and it is the only nation to use them deliberately against civilians. The United States also considered using nuclear weapons as a means to bring about the end of the Korean and Vietnam Wars. As best as can be discerned, neither the Soviet Union nor Russia has ever considered employing nuclear weapons offensively in a conflict in a similar manner to how the United States employed its nuclear weapons against Japan. Finally, the United States has upheld a nuclear first-use doctrine, exited arms control treaties, and advocated for novel technologies to disrupt the nuclear balance. The decision to use atomic weapons against Japan in the closing stages of World War II was swiftly met with controversy. Initially, dissent emerged within the ranks of senior American military and political figures, albeit privately. Although much of the public greeted news of the bombings with exultation, interpreting the event as signaling the immediate end of the conflict, this sentiment wasn't unanimous. An editorial published in September 1946 edition of Saturday Review questioned the bombing's necessity and suggested that they were done deliberately to intimidate the Soviet Union. The idea was explored in Garz Alpervortz's 1965 book, Atomic Diplomacy, Hiroshima and Potsdam, the use of atomic bomb and the American confrontation with Soviet power. Alpervortz was the first to thoroughly articulate the idea that the bombings were dropped to both bring about an immediate end to the war and to avoid large-scale Soviet involvement that could potentially replicate the Far East, what had already occurred in Europe and Central Europe. Okay, the atomic diplomatic exchange had never happened. While the Yalta Agreement of February 1945 was ambiguously defined and open to varying interpretation, Alpers asserts that President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's understanding was that Poland and much of Eastern Europe liberated by the Red Army would fall under Soviet influence. However, Harry S. Truman, who assumed the presidency in April of 1945, diverged from Roosevelt's cooperative stance, choosing instead to adopt a more confrontational approach to curtail and confine Soviet power in Europe. Encouraged by his top advisors, Truman pursued a confrontational stance with Joseph Stalin over Eastern Europe, partly driven by their perception of the atomic weapons as a potential diplomatic tool. The hardline approach with the Soviet Union had been previously avoided for three key reasons. Roosevelt was committed to cooperating with Stalin. The United States wanted to avoid Germany and the Soviet Union signing a separate peace, because a hardline approach could result in losing Soviet support against Japan. It was initially thought Soviet forces would be necessary to hold down the Khotan army in Manchuria to prevent the reinforcement of the Japanese homelands. However, by April of 1945, Allied forces had secured control of the sea lines around Japan, precluding this possibility. By April of 1945, a Soviet entry into Pacific theater was no longer considered necessary for Americans to complete a successful invasion of Japan. Although the bombs could have been seen as a valuable bargaining tool in the ongoing negotiations with the Soviet Union regarding the conclusion of World War II, their use didn't necessarily hinge on the military deployment. Alpervortz suggests the Secretary of War, Henry L. Stimson, who possessed extensive knowledge of the bomb program within Truman's cabinet, learned towards sharing information about nuclear energy and the bomb, along with proposing Soviet participation into International Atomic Energy Control Commission. This concept of an atomic diplomatic exchange was already being discussed as early as December of 1944 to encourage Japanese surrender and favorable terms in the future Soviet negotiations. The notion of non-military atomic bomb demonstration, such as the detonation of Tokyo Harbor, was seriously considered. Okay. Japan's impending surrender at the time of the bombings. A central and enduring argument that persists to this day is that the use of atomic bombs ended the war early. They thus prevented considerable losses, both Japanese and American, that would have come with an invasion of the Japanese home islands. But there is considerable evidence to suggest that Japan was already defeated before the atomic bombs were dropped. The Japanese Navy, as an example, had for the most part been sunk by the spring of 1945, allowing for near total Allied control of the seas around Japan. Moreover, the Japanese Air Force had been so thoroughly obliterated that American bombers attacked with near impunity. The routine firebombing raids over Tokyo included the devastation attacks on March 9th and 10th of 1945 that claimed 100,000 lives. Exemplify this. During the period between March 9th and June 15th of 1945, out of around 7,000 bombing missions, only 135 American planes were lost, underscoring the extent of American air supremacy over Japan. Alpervortz further highlights that the Japanese had initiated peace envoy missions as early as September of 1944, reaching out to figures like Chinese nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek by December of 1944, and engaging with the USSR in April of 1945. That the Japanese were interested in negotiating a peace was well known. Moreover, the Americans knew that there was a potential for surrender without necessitating an invasion as early as April of 1945, providing there was clearly in the surrender terms. The argument that the bombings prevented the necessity of an invasion is undermined by the very cities that were chosen to be bombed. It is now known that many of the 9 atomic bombs were proposed to be used tactically against Japanese military targets as part of a plan, though never authorized invasion. That 2 of those bombs were ultimately used against cities of no particular military value is evidence that the plans for an invasion had already been abandoned by August of 1945. The potential of a massive confrontation between the Red Army and the Kuomintang Army in Manchuria introduced the prospect of Soviets seeking equal participation in the subsequent conflict ending talks. This would have positioned them as assert a stronger claim over the region, resulting in gains that could far exceed the initial claims to territories lost in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904. Consequently, the atomic bomb, instead of being used tactically, evolved into a strategic weapon of terror intended to jolt Japan into immediate surrender. So this was just a bullying tactic. You killed innocent people as a means of a bullying tactic to bully Russia. Notably, American policymakers had concluded that the Soviet involvement in the war was comparable both psychologically and militarily to the impact of atomic weapons. Uh, the decision to drop the bombs was not driven by military necessity to conclude the war, but was deliberately undertaken to end the war on American terms and to put the United States in the best possible negotiating position. The argument of military necessity is further undermined by the stance taken by 3 of the most prominent American military figures of World War II, Generals Douglas MacArthur and Dwight D. Eisenhower, along with Admiral William Leahy. These leaders opposed the use of atomic bombs against Japan because they felt it was completely unnecessary. Bloodshed for sunken costs. Ronald Tahaki's 1995 book, Hiroshima, Why America Dropped the Atomic Bomb, concludes that some of the motivation to use the weapons was simply a consequence of an immense cost in developing them, foreshadowing Eisenhower's later warning of military-industrial complex. By 1945, the Manhattan Project had taken on a life of its own, employing 120,000 people with an associated cost of about $2 billion, roughly $34 billion as it adjusted for inflation. Takaki proposes a comparison to the contemporary U.S. auto industry of the era. To borrow a term from modern times, the atomic bomb had become too big to fail. So people already put so much investment of money into it that they were just going to go through with it, even though it was unnecessary and would cost, it would take away a lot of human life. Takaki reveals that as the war and development of the atomic weapons progressed, the bomb's use in combat wasn't guaranteed. Roosevelt's last known thought on the matter was that the bomb could be used against Germany or Japan, if necessary. Yet he proposed at a preliminary demonstration in order to give the Japanese the opportunity to reconsider American terms of surrender. This approach was the option referred to by 46% of the 150 Manhattan Project physicists polled in the summer of 1945. Takaki's, sorry. All right. Takaki's findings also revealed that both Truman and General George Marshall were aware well before the decision to deploy the bombs that the frequently cited casualty estimated of up to 1 million for a Japanese home islands invasion was inaccurate. Contrary to the perpetrated concern for minimizing the avoidable loss of life, it was widely acknowledged among the highest ranks of the Allied command that bombing operations, whether in Germany or Japan, were becoming increasingly lethal and predominantly impacting civilian populations. You knew this would impact civilians, non-combatants. You knew this would impact innocent people. A 1946 bombing survey confirmed that the remarkable success of the bombing campaign supported the assessment that Japan would have surrendered prior to November 1st, 1945, the date of the proposed invasion of Kyushu, without the need for atomic weapons or Soviet entry into the conflict. That's all I'm going to read right now. All right. But you get what I'm saying here. All right. You get what's being said here. Now, let's talk about the weapons of mass destruction right now. Here we go.
Mr. Bush, when are you going to apologize for the million Iraqis that are dead because you lied? You lied about weapons of mass destruction. You lied about connections to 9/11. You lied about Iraq being a threat. You sent me to Iraq. You sent me to Iraq in 2003. My friends are dead. Joshua Castile. You killed people. You lied. You lied about WMDs. A million Iraqis are dead because you lied. My friends are dead because you lied. You need to apologize. Mr. Bush, when are you going to apologize for the million Iraqis that are dead because you lied? You lied about weapons of mass destruction. You lied about connections to 9/11. You lied about Iraq being a threat. You sent me to Iraq. You sent me to Iraq in 2003. My friends are dead. Joshua Castile. You killed people. You lied. You lied about WMDs. A million Iraqis are dead because you lied. My friends are dead because you lied. You need to apologize. Apologize.
Nabal was dead because Jezebel lied. Iraq weapons of mass destruction. Remember the lies of wars past. All right. February 5th, 2003, U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell made an impression to the United Nations claiming Iraq possessed and was imminently planning to use weapons of mass destruction. The allegation was used by the President George W. Bush as the excuse to launch his destructive invasion and occupation of Iraq. It was eventually concluded that no weapons existed and the war was all based on a lie. What was supposed to be a rapid shock and awe strike turned into an 8-year occupation that cost hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, perhaps even as many as millions, their lives and killed at least 4,000 U.S. troops. Arik Velocious, then PW editor Tim Wheeler, covered Powell's speech as it happened. The article originally appeared in People's Weekly World on February 15th, 2003, under the headline Powell at UN Caught in Web of Lies. New York, the Bush administration faced a widening credibility gap in its efforts to convince the world that the war to remove Saddam Hussein is imperative, even if 100,000 Iraqis die in the Pentagon's shock and awe war scenario. CNN USA Today Gallup poll released February 4th showed that only 24% of the people trust George W. Bush, while 63% trust Secretary of State Colin Powell on Iraq. Thus, Powell has been assigned as chief drum major for the war. He delivered a smooth 90-minute speech to the UN Security Council on February 5th, arguing that Saddam Hussein is deceiving the UN and only war can disarm Iraq. Powell relied heavily on British intelligence report entitled Iraq, Its Infrastructure of Concealment, Deception, and Intimidation. Secretary of State told the ambassadors, every statement I make today is backed up by solid sources. I would call my colleagues' attention to the fine paper that the United Kingdom distributed yesterday, which describes in exquisite detail Iraq deception activities. The day after Powell's speech, Cambridge University scholar Glenn Rogala revealed that a report cited by Powell was a plagiarized patchwork of old magazine articles. Entire sections were lifted verbatim, including errors in punctuation from a dissertation by Ibrahim al-Marashi, a postgraduate student at the Monterey Institute of International Studies in California. Reached by reporters, al-Marashi pointed out that his thesis covered Iraq's weapons in 1990, not 2003. Paul failed as France, Germany, Russia, China in as France, Germany, Russia, China, indeed, a majority of nations lined up against war while calling more time and more inspectors to disarm Iraq. John Quigley, a professor of international law at the Ohio State University, told the world the U.S. has presented information to the Security Council on war and peace issues that later turned out to be false. It was presented as current information about Iraq when it was in fact several years old. Powell's entire presentation was shaky in terms of the facts. Plagiarism by a student is one thing. This is more serious. They are talking about going to war on the basis of that report. Gordon Clark, national coordinator of the Iraq Pledge of Resistance, told the world chief UN inspector Hans Blix says that there is no evidence to support Powell's claim that Iraq is using mobile laboratories to hide weapons of mass destruction. That's one reason the French and the Germans are pushing their proposals for expanded inspections and peacekeepings as an alternative to war. Bush, he said, is losing support, and they are speeding up their war timetable because they know time is running out. Clark warned that as many as 100,000 people could die in a unilateral preemptive U.S. war on Iraq. Powell flashed satellite spy photos of Sargat, a village not under Saddam Hussein's control, where the military coup Ansar al-Islam, he claimed, is hiding a terrorist poison and explosives factory. 20 reporters visited the village and found no signs of a factory or even running water. Two Ansar officials who escorted journalists through the village spoke of its unmistakable crude condition and dismissed Powell's allegations as baseless. Powell claimed that Iraq has given safe haven to an al-Qaeda cell founded by al-Masab al-Zakwi, but the New York Times revealed that a member of the Qatar royal family has set up a safe house for al-Zakari in Qatar and provided him $1 million bank account to finance his terrorist activities. The Bush administration has been silent because Qatar is the main base for the U.S. war in Iraq. We will certainly win the war, but how do we win the peace if there is a massive civilian casualties, said Senator Edward M. Kennedy, Democrat of Massachusetts. In an op-ed, the Boston Globe on February 8th, what will it cost in American lives, especially if the war involves hand-to-hand, door-to-door urban combat in Baghdad? He and Senator Robert Byrd, Democrat of West Virginia, are co-sponsors of the resolution that would repeal the authorization for U.S. war in Iraq, approved last October. Republican Sheila Jackson Lee, Representative Sheila Jackson Lee, Democrat of Texas, and 11 other House members have introduced a companion measure in the House to avoid U.S. casualties in house-to-house combat. The Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld has embraced the shock and awe strategy in which the U.S. will strike Iraq with 800 or more cruise missiles in the first 2 days, more than was unleashed in the 40 days of Operation Desert Storm. It is based on a 1996 book, Shock and Awe, Achieving Rapid Dominance by Harlan Ullman, published by the National Defense University in Washington. Ullman writes that his plan will achieve a simultaneously effect, rather like the nuclear weapons of Hiroshima, not taking days or weeks, but minutes. Wow. Janice Seals, public relations director of the American Friends Service Committee, told the world, will dropping bombs on the women and children of Iraq make us safer, or will it fuel more anger and despair across the Middle East and around the globe? Should we give the UN weapons inspectors the time they need and not use this as a trick to launch war? And that's what they did. And many American lives were lost over a lie. come back to God. Mm-mm. America was never with God. And they used that, try to say God is okay with going to war. This is a heathen nation that focuses on greed, war, and death. Never was with God. They'll use them as a prop to try to get what they want. The American people will love it. From colonization, poisoning Native Americans with blankets, smallpox, the Devil's Punch Bowl, discrimination due to the color of your skin, whether you're black, Chinese. Oh, the Japanese internment camps. How about the fact that Australia gave intelligence that the Japanese were coming to Pearl Harbor to bomb it? And that type of intel was ignored. Hmm. Interesting. You can look it up. America was never for God. Peace and God bless.